mom's side comes from Beausoleil. And so for our community, we were kind of moved after we were split up from Coldwater Narrows. We had originally moved over to Beausoleil Island, not Christian Island, but Beausoleil Island, which is over towards Port Severn. So that was one of our settlements after we had left Coldwater Narrows. But unfortunately, the island there was not built to sustain any life. It's if you guys have ever been out there, it's almost like a big rock, that island. So you can't. There's actually no area there for anybody to be able to do any farming or anything like that. And then so what had happened is one of the chiefs there had led the people away from Beausoleil Island, and what they did was they went to find a new home. They went to find a place where they could be, where they would be stuff that our people did. And then so eventually our people were moved from, like I said, moved from Beausoleil Island, and then we went over, now known as Beausoleil First. There's a few different names that my Chimin is saying. There's Gitchinimimnising, which is actually like the traditional, the traditional Ojibwe name for that island, which actually translates to Big Sturgeon Island, which is a whole other story, which we probably won't get into today. And so my people were moved over to that island, and then we began, building our life over there, because we were surrounded by water. Our people were so happy because they had those waters to be able to fish in. There was areas where we could do farming, and we had everything there that we needed to help sort of sustain us. So a lot of our people in our community are big on fish, because there is actually not a whole lot of wildlife that kind of run through the island, obviously, because it's hard for them to get there. So our community was very big on fish, and that was what we used to help sustain us. So eventually, our community began to grow and build, and all of it began to grow to our community. And the Indian agents came in, and they came in with the nuns. And so for our community, which is this is a story that you'll hear from many First Nations communities. So for many communities, a lot of the Indian agents would kind of decide, whether or not all of the children in that community would be sent to a residential school, or if they would build something called Indian Day Schools. I don't know if you guys have heard about Indian Day Schools. If anybody has heard of it. So Indian Day Schools was I guess started in an effort to help teach the children of more rural communities, and so like my community being on an island, they built day schools within our community instead of sending all of our children to a residential school. But that's not to say that our community didn't experience that. We do have elders in our communities that were taken. I guess like it wasn't when they were little, but it was when they were moving into like their teen years. So there was like a group of, I believe, like 20 kids that were taken in the early 50s, 50s and 60s, that were taken, and they were kind of some were sent to Spanish, the Spanish residential school up north, and then some were sent to Brantford, which if you guys know anything about that school, that was the Brantford residential school was the first big one that was built in Canada. Um, and so some of our people were sent to residential schools, but a lot of the kids within our community went to Indian day schools. So as I was talking earlier about the Indian agent coming into the community with the nuns, what he was coming with was the Roman Catholic nuns, but also also those representatives from the United Church. And so our community, you know, we didn't have roads built or anything like that yet. And so if you guys actually take a look at a map of Christian Island, you will see one road that kind of slices right through our main community, where the dock, there's like the dock, the main dock on the island, and then there's a road that kind of goes straight up. So that road was built by the Indian agent and the nuns, because our community was all in that main area towards where the dock sits now, close to the water and things like that. And at the time when they had come in, they were trying to figure out like how are we going to decide which families go to which church. So instead what they did was they actually to build that road that goes straight through the community, and then if on this side of the road, if you were on the right side of the road, then you and all of the Catholic Church. And if you ended up on this, then you and all your family would go to the and the other particularly difficult was that, you know, this was actually divided, because what ended up happening afterwards was the had made an announcement to the community that if you were on this side of, there was no way you were allowed to be caught on this side of the road. Families ended up being divided, and then happening was, you know, families would want, like, you know, they'd want to there, so they would actually way back into the bush, be late at night, where if they wanted to visit their family, they would have to go far back into the bush where nobody can see them. And nobody was allowed to know about that, because what would happen if somebody from, let's say, the road caught you on the road, and then caught you on this side of the road, what they tell the Indian agent, and then what would happen is who was caught on the wrong side of the road, their food rations would be from them for the week, and then usually given to the families on the other side of the road that, you know, reported them. So it was a very tough time, you know, because for Indigenous people, you know, our families are us, you know, our families are, how do I explain this? Our connection to our families is almost like our lifeline. You know, we always make sure that we maintain those good connections with our brothers, with our sisters, with our nieces, with our nephews. And that's another cool thing too about Indigenous family systems, is that, like, for my brother, I'll use this as an example. For my brother, his kids I view them as my kids, because as an auntie, it's my duty to step in to help my brother raise his kids. And, you know, as that's the same thing that goes for, like, my brothers too. It's their duty as an uncle to step in when, you know, our siblings have kids, that we step in to help them every way that we can. So, and a lot of our families too were raised closely together. So biologically, I have 5 brothers and sisters. But when we look at our Indigenous family system and how a lot of our parents would, you know, take care of our cousins, you know, we have like first cousins, second cousins, things like that. Your first cousins are always viewed as like your brothers and sisters as well, because raised very closely together. So when that community was divided, it was very, very, very difficult, and it was very, very hard on them, right? Because it's like, what am I gonna do now that I can't see my brother and his kids because they're on the other side of the road. So that was a very difficult time in Chiminising history, but that's not to say that that's something that happened in a lot of First Nations, actually all across Canada, where things like that had happened. So for my community, like I had said, we had the two schools. So if you guys aren't familiar with what Indian day schools are, the way my mom and dad had described it to me when I asked them was like a residential school, but I got to go home at the end of the day. For right now, there's a huge lawsuit that's happening for survivors of an Indian day school. Because it's a lot of people who went to suffered the same traumatic experience at residential school. So there won't be this person that their family hasn't experienced this. Family didn't experience being taken, or their parents or their grandparents or their great grandparents didn't experience being in residential school, then they have probably gone to, I believe, as early as like the 1600s, right up until 1996 is when the last one was shut down. But for Indian day schools, those began kind of like earlier on in the 1900s, and they went right up until 2003 is when the last one like not shut down, but so what happened with the Indian day schools is the responsibility of those schools switched from the churches over to the community itself. So for my community, like I had mentioned, we had the two schools, which were almost across from each other. There's this one, which is like the main intersection, I guess, on Christian Island, and then on this side, in one corner was the United Church Day School, and then on this corner was the Roman Catholic Day School. So my parents, when they met, I asked them this because like every kid asks their parents this question, right? Like, oh, how did you meet dad? How did you meet mom? So there was this huge, like I had mentioned, there was this huge divide in the community, but what it created was almost like this, like, I don't know how to properly say it. I don't want to say like bad blood, but like, my parents would say that like, the way that they met was, they would be walking down the road or whatever, and my dad would be throwing apples at my mom because she was a Catholic, and my mom would be throwing rocks at him because he goes to the other day school. And I'm like, oh wow, like such a romantic story. And then, later on they ended up getting married and having 6 kids, but so that's how they met, and that's what it was like when they were little, and that's what it was like, when their parents were little. That was the same type of thing where, they were throwing rocks or snowballs or apples or whatever at each other, and as they're on their way to school in the morning. So for those schools with my community, afterwards, what had happened, and I believe it happened back in like the late 70s, early 80s, is when they actually amalgamated the day schools in my community. So afterwards, it just became one big school. And then the responsibility of that day school be 4, I believe. And so for me, like I had said, I have five older siblings, so I'm actually the youngest one in my family. And I'm actually the only one in my family that did not go to a day school. Because by the time I had gotten into school, the responsibility was transferred, like the June, I think, like at the end of that school year, the responsibility transferred over to the community. So I just barely avoided that. But all of my siblings, you know, they were subjected to, you know, going and learning in these day schools. And for my family, like we do have, so my uncle, like I had mentioned earlier, how there were some kids that were taken to residential schools, but the majority of the kids remained in the community and attended the day schools. My uncle, his name was Sal, he was everybody's uncle in the community. For him, what he did was he used to work at the daycare and in our community, and he was a custodian there, and he absolutely loved his job. Like, he loved it so much. He would go in, he would do his work, but also too, one of the things that he really enjoyed was actually going in and being able to actually sit with the kids and, you know, sit with the kids. He would teach them music. He taught himself how to play guitar. He taught himself how to play the piano, and he taught himself all of these different things all by ear. And so when he was working with the kids, he would go in and he would go and take his guitar. He would play songs for them. He would teach them how to play the spoons. And so they were always very excited when they saw him. And so while he was working there, he had worked there for over 25 years, which is a very long time. So he saw many, many, many children coming through that daycare center, right? And one thing that he always enjoyed was like all of those kids calling him uncle, right? So he was everybody's uncle back home. For him, he was the only one in my family on my mom's side that was taken and he was sent to a residential school. So for him, he was sent to the Spanish residential school up north. And I believe he was 8 years old when he left, and then he didn't come back until he was 12. So he was gone for a few years while all of his other siblings remained in the community and went to the day schools. My uncle never liked to talk about what happened to him there. I don't blame him. There was one time, and you know, for Indigenous people, like your aunties and uncles are like your second moms and dads. So like for us, we become very close with uncles. You know, we're always, you know, they're always there, and we can go and sit with them and chat with them and things like that, right? So I would always do that when I was younger. I would go and sit with my uncle because my uncle didn't have any kids, and he didn't have any kids of his own. So he really took on that uncle role, being uncle to everybody. But so what I would do is I would go and sit with him, and one day I went and I made him lunch. We were just kind of hanging out, and I had asked him, and I'm like, uncle, I'm like, because at this point we were getting ready to do his 25-year celebration dinner for working at the daycare for so long. And I had gone to go and sit with him, and I had made him lunch because I wanted to ask him some questions because I was putting together this presentation that was going to be played at this dinner for him. And I remember sitting there asking him, and I'm like, uncle, and I'm like, what did you love most? Like you were such an amazing person to be, you know, in this daycare, you know, doing all of the things that you did, and you know, you saw many kids come through, and everybody just loves you, and you know, you made everybody happy. And I'm like what motivated you to do that? I'm asking him questions like this, right? And it was the first time that he had ever talked to me about his experience in residential school. He had told me a little bit about, he didn't go into great detail, and but even just the little bit that he gave me that time was so moving, and it almost like shook me to my core, to hear, you know, what he had experienced when he was so young. And he had told me about, you know, about the abuse that he suffered, and, you know, how he just wanted to be a little boy and just play with his friends and, you know, have fun and things like that. And he didn't have that opportunity. Instead, he was talking about how he was living in constant fear during those years that he attended residential school, and how he was so scared to be who he wanted to be, and how he was so scared to be silly and have fun, you know, all of these things that kids should do. And so as he's telling me this, I'm just like, I'm in complete shock, right? Because this is something that he never ever talked about. Never talked about this experience or anything. And so when he opened up and he was telling me about this, and he's like, that's why I did what I did at the daycare. He's like, that's the reason why I came in, and I would come in and tell the kids jokes. And I would come in and I would share songs with them and teach them how to play the guitar, teach them how to play the spoons, and be silly with them. Because I wanted them to have the childhood that I didn't have. And as soon as he said that, I was just like, whoa, like, like this is something that, like, I never heard my uncle speak about. See, like, you know, even though he had gone through all of these experiences that he went through at residential school, you know, he came out on the other end with that, like, very good and kind, to always want to see smiles on children, and, you know, to encourage them to be silly, to have fun and things like that. And so he was, you know, he wasn't a teacher at the school, you know, he did teach the kids a lot. So that was something that, like, I will never ever forget. And one of the things I always love doing is love sharing that, because our people, the Indigenous, are very resilient, and I think that the reason is because it goes back to our original teachings. You know, we have our 7 grand, is that no matter what we go through, you know, puts us where he needs us to be. And I feel like that's why my was at that daycare for so long, you know, teaching those kids, because to be there to encourage them to be silly. He wanted to encourage them to fun and, you know, be kids and enjoy things like that. Even though, you know, he didn't get that same experience, I'm sure that going forward into the future, that the kids coming after him. So for us as Indigenous people, it's in our teachings. Whatever we do, we always think back 7 generations. We always think of our ancestors and what they've gone through and acknowledge them, so that everything that we do it in 7 generations back. But we also are thinking of the next 7 generations to come. You know, that we're a good foundation for that good life that they're going to experience. These different atrocities and things like that. You know, our people are still thinking with that same frame of mind. And, you know, we're right now too, what we're seeing is, for my community, our community was heavily influenced by the church for many, many years. So it wasn't until, like, maybe about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, where our community finally started opening up to our culture and to our old ways. Our older ones, our elders, would always speak in the language and things like that, but you know, nobody really practiced the culture. So for our community, the culture didn't come back into our community until about 20 years ago. I was, maybe about 25, because I was still little at the time. And it was met with heavy resistance. It was met with heavy resistance from the churches. It was met with heavy resistance from chief and council. It was met with heavy resistance from the community itself for those ones who didn't want to practice the culture, or anything like that. And so I was actually my uncles on my mom's side who had gone out and they went to go and search for people who knew our teaching, search for people who knew our culture and our language and our ceremonies and things like that, to bring them back in the community. And so for my one uncle who passed away in the early 90s, he had said was when he passed away that he wanted a traditional funeral. And for those funerals are beautiful, because for us it's a celebration on this side that, you know, our loved one is leaving. And but then we think about our teachings and we think about our stories and we think of it when we come home. So for my community, my uncle, when he saw that and when he learned about that, he was like, when I pass, that's what I want. That's how I want to go home. So for our community, this was the first time that this ceremony had been done in many, many, many years. And so unfortunately, you know, there was a heavy influence by the churches within the community and within the families within the community. So what had happened was my family was met with huge resistance. Even when they were on their way to bury my uncle at our traditional graveyard, you know, people were almost lining the roads waiting for them to go by to, you know, shout very mean things and hurtful things at them as they passed, and you know, it was brutal. And then what happened afterwards is about a week after, my family was called before the community, because what the community had wanted was they actually wanted to banish my family from the community and have them removed from the community because they brought the culture back here. And my uncle Migona, his English name was Floyd. Him and my mother stood in front of our community as our community, they had this like community meeting at the hall. And my mom and her family, their family was to go to the Roman Catholic Church. And so, but my mom and my uncles and even my grandparents, you know, they still respected those old ways, but still respected, you know, the ways of the church too. And so what my uncle had did was he went and stood in front of the community and said, you know, we can live in balance with, you know, the views of the church, but also with our old ways. And he stood there with a Bible in one hand and an eagle feather in the other and said, all we need is respect. All we need is respect for each other. And it was, after that, it was almost absolute, because, you know, people didn't understand. They didn't understand that, you know, that those two that exist in a good, kind way. As after that, I think, but after that, you know, people started coming up and they started asking questions. They started asking questions about the culture. They started asking questions like, how do you balance, you know, the ways of the Roman Catholic Church, but also how do you balance those old ways too? And, you know, they were coming to my family and coming to my uncles and actually seeking that advice, because, you know, that was something that they wanted to do too. You know, they wanted to, for a lot of our older generations in the community, you know, people wanted to, you know, respect their parents and their grandparents, you know, who were devoted to the church, but they also wanted to respect those traditional ways as well. And so now what we're seeing in our community is we're seeing actually a lot of our younger ones, you know, they're picking up those old ways. They're picking up the culture, they're picking up the language, they're going to ceremonies, but also too, they're teaching the older ones too. And so for one, my mother, her name is Ojaushko Benishikwe, which is a bluebird, but it's not just any bluebird, it's like the creator's favorite bird. And so her name is Roseanne. And my mom, I used to be, when I was little, I used to go to church all the time with my mom, actually. Used to go almost every Sunday for a while there. And like I said, my parents were on separate sides of the road. So I would go with my mom, go to mass. And so that was like interesting, but like also too though, to see my parents, you know, they would still go to church, they would respect those ways in the community too, but they would also, you know, they also participated in the culture, which was awesome to see. And you know, still like thinking about how hard the government had worked to get rid of our culture and get rid of our languages, you know, and replace it with something else. You know, my community found a way where they could still participate in both. And like my uncle had said, you know, respecting both of those ways of life. And that's really what got my community through that time. And now, like, what I'm seeing is that there's so many who are, you know, picking up those things that were lost, but also, you know, still respecting those churches that reside in our community too. And my mom, so, like that's what I was talking about. So for her third degree now, but my mom, and I love her so much because she's so adorable. And but also too, what she says is she always reiterates those words of her brother. And you know, because even though she's, you know, very into her culture, very into her ceremonies and her traditional ways and her traditional way of life, she still will go and attend church with her friends. She will still take part in that. She will still respect that. And I love that. I love that for her, and I love that for all of her friends, you know, that she goes with. I don't attend much anymore because I don't live in my community anymore. But you know, that's just so important too, right? And I feel like it's so very important too, right? Because there's not just one of the things that my uncle has always said is that there's not just one way. There's no one right way to pray. There's no one right way for a way of life or anything like that. And you know, that we all we may all come from different backgrounds and things like that, but one of the things that he always told me is that we're all praying to the same God. We're all praying to the same creator, and that all creation stories are true, which is another important which was another important teaching for us too. So that's why it's so important for us to respect those ways. And so, yeah, that was a lot of information I just gave you guys. So I think what I'll do is I will end it there. But if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to come and chat with me. I just wanted to say miigwech for inviting me to be here and speak today. I hope I gave you guys some good insight into my community and what we have what we have experienced, but also yeah, I hope there was I gave you guys some good things to think about and walk away with today. So I'll say thank you and miigwech.